been with us for a few years now. His work focuses on dynamic energy budget modeling across scale dynamics of infectious diseases, works a lot on schistosomes in snails and humans, and very excitingly he was awarded the 2019 Ecological Society of America Early Career Fellowship for his work on understanding how biodiversity, resource and competition gradients affect disease risk. So we're very, very fortunate to have Dave here. And then I want to introduce the topic of this debate, which is disease ecology. Has it contributed more generally to our understanding of ecology? With something that Les mentioned in class in 2009, when Nicole Gerardo and Les and I really taught this ecology graduate course together. And we've already heard this, that Les has this encyclopedic, that's the word, memory of quotes and things, and either that or he fakes it, right? Because the rest of us we don't know if John Maynard Smith really said that, right? We were there. But so, I remember one of the things he said in class, we were discussing big ideas in disease ecology, and Les brought up Virginia Woolf, and he said, I'm probably misquoting, but he said something along the lines, Virginia Woolf didn't want to become known as a famous female writer. She wanted to be a famous writer. And then he said, so you shouldn't strive to be a famous disease ecologist. You should strive to be a well-known ecologist, right? And I think that is a really good introduction to this debate. So the plan for this is everyone's going to have a few minutes to make their point, if you have any. And then you're going to fight with each other. But we also want audience participation. So please, get mixed up in this conversation, this brutal debate. Take us back to those days. Les, do you want to take it up?
Pete, you ignorant fool.
I just want to say from the outset that I'm going to disagree with everything that Les says.
Well, I was having this discussion with Charles Darwin, actually. No, so, yes, the quote from Virginia Woolf is real. She said that. She didn't want to be considered a feminist writer. She wanted to be a writer. She didn't want to be narrowly cast in any way. And when we were starting disease ecology interests, we set up a discussion. I mean, there was a discussion in bioscience and at our seminar at ESA about the distinction between trying to understand disease as sort of an invasive process which needs to be kind of managed, controlled, beat down, and it certainly is the case. That's the way we think about it in human infectious diseases. As opposed to trying to understand the role of diseases, pathogens. Let me just not call them diseases in that case. The role of pathogens in kind of mediating natural processes. And I was going to give the example of the distinction between the two is some wonderful work. There was one of our new students got her start. I've forgotten her name. She's a wonderful new student. I think she's working with you. First year student.
All the wonderful new students.
She said she got her start by working with Carol Augsburger. Carol Augsburger is a professor at the University of Illinois, and we were graduate students together. She did this phenomenal piece of research for her thesis at La Selva, where she went out and she actually watered seedlings. She carried cans of water out into the jungle and she watered seedlings in experimental manipulation to try to figure out when things could germinate and when they flowered and how what the forces were that were mediating what species could establish and persist in the jungle. It was a big question of why the jungle is as diverse as it is. And one of the things that she found was the very important organizing force of damping off disease in seedling establishment. And it was a kind of a focus on the disease as a natural process influencing patterns of biological diversity that might account for why the tropics are more diverse than other places. And that's a different way of approaching pathogens and their operation than just thinking about them in disease as something that needs to be, something that is bad, you know. And a lot of us in disease ecology, like me and Jamie and well, all of us here.
Maybe.
Well, not me.
Not
you,
me.
not you, mate. But we work on human infectious diseases, you know, and I was thinking Willie Sutton, you know, the famous Willie Sutton, the bank robber. When he asked why does he rob banks, he said, well, that's where the money is. You know? So there's some of that dynamic in terms of our focus on disease. You know, that's where the money is. And we've lost track of some of focus on trying to understand. Now, Pete here, I know he's going to disagree, but I'm going to compliment him.
I disagree with that.
Did some phenomenal work on the role of infectious diseases in regulating populations. That's a fundamental question in ecology, still of interest. Part of it is because ecology and evolution have very much diverged, and people have lost sight of some of the very basic questions in ecology that have to do with population regulation, kinds of density, dependence, and things like that. But my position will be that we still haven't really approached pathogens and their role in the organization of natural systems as a part of natural process, rather than focusing on them as entities which are fundamentally bad. That's my position. That's my story. I'm done. Bye.
So when Katia sent me the email and said, would you have this discussion, I thought the answer was really simple, because I think infectious disease biology has gained a huge amount from ecology, but ecology hasn't really, ecology of infectious disease hasn't really contributed that much, as it were, by itself. So I think it's worth going back to what disease ecology is. And disease ecology, of course, is a coalescence. Was that what you wanted me to say? It is, of course. So what Roy Anderson and Bob May did, and the clever thing about that partnership was Roy understood the biology and the empirical side, and Bob did this clever little models. That's my perspective, is they synthesized, coalesced those two disciplines, and out of the sort of ashes of what was parasitology arose disease ecology, what I sometimes call modern epidemiology. We then started to use biological understanding to build these models to get insights. We started doing experiments to test those, and we had this really fresh way. So we left, it was like a phoenix, wasn't it, Brian? That's an expression Brian and I sometimes use, a phoenix rising from the ashes of parasitology. That's this disease ecology. So, and it's that population dynamics that gave us all that wonderful...
Similar word to that, Peter.
Sorry? So, that was all great, and we then went off and did numbers of studies. One of the things I really love is the fact that you can take 2 or 3 fundamental elements of a pathogen-host interaction, like, well, Brian's work on measles, because he interrupted me. And you know, if you understand host birth rate, if you understand the seasonality forcing, and you put in that it's a fixed infectious period, then you get this wonderful array of dynamics emerge. And I think in the graph system as well with T. tenuis, we showed that those sublethal effects coupled with host birth rate could explain huge amounts in the variation in the dynamics of that system. So I think that gave us a lot. And yes, we've got into bits of the big ecological questions. You know, what are the big ecological questions? Well, bioinvasions, of course. Spatial heterogeneity, both of those play to your own work. There's the ecosystem services, the dilution effect, and those sort of things. That's had a trivial part, but it's a wonderful debate at the moment, and it's a wonderful aspects of that. Some of the bigger things, like pollution, well, there is some really cool work going on where acanthocephalins are shown to reduce heavy metals, and having a slight impact there. Atmospheric pollution, I suspect none. Fresh water, adding nutrients to fresh water, well, there's some great work there by Jason Rohr and Pete Johnson and people like that. So I think we're having an impact. Where are we failing? I still worry about, the one question that keeps me awake at night is, how the hell do these pathogens persist? These rare pathogens, how do they persist in the hosts? How does that really work? And I think we've got our system muddled up there. We're too wrapped up in our naught. We're just thinking that that's maximizes fitness, and when we see competition, it's always going to be that with the highest R naught is going to win. I think there are issues there. I think community ecology, we haven't really embraced community ecology, or I think disease ecology could do a huge amount for community ecology. And what comes to mind now, of course, is Taylor's power law, and that wonderful expression, that wonderful observation that the variance increases with the mean in multiple systems at the same rate. And that's been beautifully looked at when you look at the distribution of worms in the host population, and that some individuals have more worms than they really should be. We haven't driven down to that. I don't think in some systems we understand a little bit of what's going on, but we need to drive up on those, and we need to drive up into community ecology as well. So my thesis at the end of the day is we've dabbled in the sidelines. I think ecology has helped infectious disease biology hugely, and evolutionary biology as well. I think that those further coalescences have been very productive. But I think there's a lot we can still do.
I thought we were supposed to disagree.
I don't agree with that.
All right, Dave.
Wait, so what was the question again?
Well, you have to disagree.
So when Katja gave me that question, I thought, well, this is easy. Parasitism is the most common trophic strategy on Earth. If we want to study general ecology, we should probably make general theory and address questions that apply to the most species and most conditions that we can. What has ecology done for me? I think, what has ecology done for the disease ecologist? So I reject the question. I'm going to disagree. I reject the question. It's not relevant. I didn't get a list of rules. I just So aside from that, I would say I disagree with Pete about the issue of community ecology. I think that's one of the areas where if we haven't historically done that, that's one of the most active and exciting areas where we really are contributing. So I think the idea that host-parasite interactions don't occur in a vacuum, that we want to understand how predators of hosts or parasites affect things, that's work that I've been involved with people like the folks that you mentioned. So I think integrating parasites and predators and other trophic interactions into community ecology is a central, I think, focus right now. The other thing is something that I taught in class in disease ecology on Tuesday and Thursday this week, which is where we can do a big deal for ecology is in ecosystem function and global biogeochemistry. And I think one of the most fascinating topics that links parasitism to ecosystem functioning is stuff like the viral shunt. So for carbon flux through the ocean.
Yeah.
Where viral lysis of algae, of heterotrophic bacteria, of cyanobacteria, of all sorts of cool stuff, shoves something like 10 megatons of carbon down to the deep ocean every year. So, 10 or 15 years ago, a major question was, where's all this extra carbon going? How come there isn't as much carbon in the atmosphere as we would calculate if we just added up all the fossil fuels we're burning? And it turned out that the ocean was sucking up more carbon than we thought, and much of that should then result in ocean acidification. Even there we were not accounting for enough carbon, and so it turned out that the carbon pump and the viral shunt are really, really important players for global biogeochemical cycles. I think that's one of the coolest things to teach in my class about the importance of infectious disease for ecology. So I think as we scale up, which is definitely harder, right? It's easy to go grab your sample and sequence it if Roman can track down who's got the sample. I don't know, whatever the new gene sequencer is called, you all can tell me about that later. You can get its genome now for I don't know how much, but how much is it going to cost you to get an estimate of carbon flux or an estimate of carbon flux over an area or an amount of time that's relevant for the scales that we worry about? And so I think scaling back up is the real challenge. I think is the really exciting part in disease ecology right now, and where ecology still has problems, right? When we try to scale up our R-naughts from our unstructured SI type models, we're still making the assumptions that every infection looks the same, or that the infectious period is fixed or exponentially distributed. Very convenient assumptions for our ODEs, so we can get at that holy grail of R-naught. But I thought the title that Giulio placed on the screen, the TBA paper, to me is actually the most exciting, but maybe also it's kind of sad that says unexpected consequences, I think it was, of disease control due to complex ecological interactions, right? Yeah, I mean, why are they still unexpected? We know about some of these things. We know about the importance of resources for, say, within host infection dynamics. We know about the effect of resources for host immune function, for infectious period, in a lot of systems. Why are we then just throwing out those bits as we scale up with the simplest possible model? So I think one way where we could, as disease ecologists, kind of lead ecology is in finding better ways to project complex ecological and physiological interactions among hosts and parasites up to the population level. You don't really have to worry too much if you're about, say, host physiology, if you're scaling up a predator-prey interaction, right? Predator eats prey, converts some nutrients into new predator biomass. There's not a whole lot of exciting detail about scaling up that physiology, and maybe that's, if we come at it from that perspective, that's why we're losing that detail.
But the excitement there is the non-linearity, isn't it? That's what makes it really interesting. That's
to me, but
yeah,
I mean, getting it right is also...
And as you say, this intimate trophic interaction is special.
Well, I mean, is it special? There, I guess...
Compared to predator-prey, plant herbivore,
sure.
That's the way I was thinking.
So, depending on how you want to sort of use the functional taxonomy of natural enemies, right, you can consider something like what people might call a micro-predator, a grazer, or something like that, grazer-type herbivore, as kind of akin to a parasite, and then you've got this longer interaction that's not, that grazer fitness isn't so directly tied to the resource fitness in the same way it is for parasites. But it all exists on a continuum, and maybe, this predation is essentially like infinite virulence, right? That just, you're dead. And so I think that's just a continuum of how we're thinking about our natural enemy interactions. And so it is funny though that you don't hear people going around saying, we've got this great meeting coming up, EEIP, or EEP, I guess it would be, the Ecology and Evolution of Predation Events. Right? No one calls themselves a predation ecologist. I mean, maybe you could get a food web ecologist to really say, I deal with trophic interactions. But here we are putting this mantle on ourselves as infectious disease ecologists. We're kind of doing it to ourselves then.
Well, strategically it was important to do, just in terms of the development as a program. I mean, early on, we looked at ecology textbooks, and there was no discussion of parasitism and pathogens' role in natural ecological systems. And my suspicion is that in most ecology textbooks, there's like huge amounts of discussion on competition, which is enormously difficult to demonstrate, whereas disease, pathogen and parasites are all over the place. But just as a fulcrum point, the scaling up issue is really the key. Going up is going to be able to help us integrate more into ecology, because ecology in principle has, as population dynamics and population biology declined within the ecological community writ large. I asked Simon Levin, whatever happened to the population biologists? And he said, well, they all flocked to disease ecology. And that's pretty much true. And the ecological community still doesn't have a strong presence of traditional population ecology. The scaling up, the fulcrum point, is when we think of like the dilution effect.
Yeah.
The dilution effect, you can think about it the two ways. The usual discussion is, and there's lots of articles written about it, and you've been on many of them, that biodiversity is a good thing. Well, why is it a good thing? It's because it prevents disease. Disease is a bad thing. It's not, it's something, the dilution effect is something that you want to promote by biological diversity, rather than thinking of biological diversity as being a consequence of natural process. And what we need to understand is the geographic distribution of these processes as they might affect the global distribution of species diversity. It's a kind of like a different approach to the disease, and I'd like to see a little bit
So one of
more
my
of
other
that.
papers was a healthy ecosystem is a heavily parasitic.
Rich with
There you go.
parasites. We also teach that one.
I do want to give Katja and then Bruce. Katja's one second.
So I wanted to maybe say something a little bit jaded, but maybe as a little bit of a devil's advocate position also. So I remember when I was a grad student, we really thought of kind of diseases as really being a great data-rich model system to ask population dynamic questions, right? I mean, it has a fundamental nonlinearity in kind of transmission term and so forth, and it's really data-rich, right? And so it's wonderful. And I think we also kind of published a lot in kind of the ecological journals. You know, we said, you know, this is an example of this more general type of interaction, you know, nonlinearity and so forth. And maybe, so I know several people in the room, you know, like to publish in the tabloids, you know, every week or so. And so maybe, so perhaps we're actually not contributing as much to ecology anymore, because basically when you submit to a journal like that, you know, maybe it's because of kind of our success in terms of people being appreciating that kind of dynamic sort of perspective on things and saying, you know, hey, we understand now why this disease is, you know, hitting this age of individuals at this point in time, and then we're going to pitch it in terms of, well, this is kind of the applied, more public health aspect of it, rather than these are the ecological takeaways we can take from it, right? So possibly, you know, we're not contributing as much to ecology anymore because we're contributing possibly more to public health.
So an interesting story though, when I was in the UK, I was the chair of the panel for the funding from the NERC, which is the ecological panel. And they came to me before one meeting and said there's been all these infectious disease things, and we've decided the NERC, as in NSF, have decided that these will no longer be funded because this is all public health, this is no longer ecology. And for one day I had to fight, so I remember Pedger's grant was up there, and I had to fight tooth and nail to prove that that was actually ecology.
But oftentimes it's not pitched as ecology anymore to funding bodies, right?
But that's the cool thing, because you pitch it all over the
because
place.
you can get to higher profile, you know, publications if you don't pitch it as an ecology story, but more as a public health story.
Yeah.
Bruce?
I have two comments. One of which is it really strikes me that there's virtually little consideration of the within the host dynamics of infection. Everything is as if you then transmit, and we're sort of leaving the within host dynamics of infections to the medical people are terribly non-quantitative. They use the word strategy continuously, and it's. I mean, so there's this whole area, the interaction with the immune system, the dynamics of infections, and that's one thing that always strikes me about this distinction. So R naught becomes just a single parameter. And the other thing that strikes me now is the microbiome mania. I mean, you know, it's the old field in a different way. You know that. You know, all of our failings and none of our virtues can be attributed to this community. And you know, we're not really addressing it. You know, how do you account for the diversity and the stability? These are the questions we've been at since old fields, since, you know, things like that. I mean, and I don't see people in ecology really going into that question. And maybe it's the problem of the community ecology and the complexity of community ecology, but this is really relevant. I mean, and there's no question about, you know, but it ends up with correlative and lots of sequence data and no mechanism. And I think it's something ecologists should be directly involved with, not.
I think there are people working in that area, Bruce. I mean, you know, Andre Graham, Isabella Catadori, both people, and Giulio himself, no one else, but Giulio, another person looking at that, those specific questions, I think. So I think there's been a move into that area in the last 5 years.
And I do want to comment, Bruce, that the within-host dynamics issue, and especially the modulation of the immune system and its role in that, is the basis of our well-received NIH training grant that Jaap just wrote. So
I just want to bring a couple of these things together. I agree with